Judge Holloway. Hey.
The Silent Hill franchise has been around for 26 years now. And during this long period of time, we have had more than 15 games, comprising a mix of mainline installments, spin-offs, and even remakes. However, the journey behind making all these games is really confusing and hard to evaluate because it's literally one of the most shaky in gaming history. And it's a combination of ups and downs, even though the franchise is insanely popular in general. The timeline can be divided into two chapters. The first chapter is about the Japanese Silent Hill games, which are basically Silent Hill 1, 2, 3, and 4. While the second chapter is about the Western Silent Hill games, which are most of the remaining releases. The crazy part is that even the Japanese side was not stable like many people think, especially on the financial standards. Because, believe it or not, the first two games, Silent Hill 1 and 2, were actually the only commercial successes that exceeded expectations, while Silent Hill 3 and 4 were considered a setback in sales.
I don't get it.
But even this setback can be considered a major success when we compare it to the disasters on the Western side, which was known by its infamous inability to capture the spirit of Silent Hill, the lack of quality storytelling, and, most importantly, the horrible sales. These commercial flops were disappointing for Konami and very damaging for the developers. But there's one specific studio that literally could not survive the failure of their game, which led them to a tragic fate that any developer fears to face. The game in question, ladies and gentlemen, is none other than Silent Hill Downpour, the last main entry in the Silent Hill series, and also the project that was intended to cause the revival of the franchise after its apparent demise. In this video, I'm going to talk about how this game saw the light, who made it, and above all, what happened after its release and what exactly went wrong. So without further ado, let's start. Following the shutdown of Team Silent in 2005, which was the original Japanese team behind the first 4 games, Konami felt completely lost about what to do with the franchise and who could handle it for them. This led them to multiple Western studios who eventually made games like Homecoming, Shattered Memories, and Origins. But none of these projects managed to help the franchise go back on track. However, the issue is not only the developers' failure to deliver, but also the fact that Konami had shifted its approach at that time and wanted them to create something different, far away from the previous Silent Hill games. Later on, Konami realized that this plan was not working at all, and players were not really happy about changing the formula that made the series special in the first place. As a result, in 2009, Konami accepted the defeat and decided to produce a new Silent Hill game that claims back the franchise's roots of atmospheric horror and exploration, moving away from the action-heavy direction of titles like Homecoming. Subsequently, they came up with the concept of Murphy Pendleton, a prisoner whose journey through Silent Hill Town would unlock repressed memories, with water and rain specifically chosen as recurrent thematic elements to heighten the psychological tension. The idea of making the protagonist seem like a criminal was intentional, to evoke moral ambiguity, even though initially it sparked debate among the narrative designers about centering the game on a bad guy, which pushed them even more to keep this detail vague and intriguing for the player.
You know exactly why.
But after composing the story and understanding what they want, Konami's mission became finding the right people who can turn this story into a full game with convenient mechanics, nice visuals, and a perfect atmosphere. The problem, however, is that Konami was notorious for its tight budgets when producing their stuff, which is exactly why they chose small Western studios to make Silent Hill games after Team Silent was gone. With this mindset, Konami's attention eventually landed in Czech Republic, where a group of ambitious developers founded a new studio in 2008 called Vatra Games. These developers used to work at 2K Czech, and they had some experience to rely on, but they wanted to start from scratch by making their own games, no matter how small they are. Konami's decision to hire Vatra came after a press conference in San Francisco in April 2010, where they showed a trailer for Silent Hill 8, which was received with enthusiasm by Vatra.
Silent Hill has helped shape what horror games are meant to be, so we're borrowing influences from what the successfully executed in the past, the disturbing creatures, the mind-boggling and mind-bending psychology that transports players to an alternative nightmare world.
The Konami team saw Vatra's love for the series, along with their impressive profile. And even the studio's location in the city of Brno was attractive for them, because they felt that its moody historical ambience could also be used to influence the game's atmosphere. But make no mistake, Konami's #1 reason to pick them was their fresh career and their desire to stand out as a small studio, which means that an offer from Konami can't be rejected, no matter the budget or conditions. With that being said, Konami decided to test their capabilities first by giving them a small project called Russian Attack, which is a game that came out in 2011 and no one knew existed. But nevertheless, it was actually good and well made. When Konami was finally convinced, they officially gave them permission to make Silent Hill 8, which later on became known as Silent Hill Downpour. Because the journey from concept to release was actually far from smooth, and so many changes happened along the way. But the real questions are, did they make a good Silent Hill game, and did Downpour meet expectations? Or did they miss the mark? Well, the answer is yes and no for both questions. And let me explain why. Downpour officially saw the light on March 13, 2012, and that day was crucial because it was chosen after multiple delays in order to release the best game possible. At this point, the story was confirmed that it's about Murphy Pendleton, a prisoner with a very mysterious past who survives a bus crash during a transfer and ends up stranded in Silent Hill Town. First of all, let me tell you that visually, the developers actually succeeded in building the best-looking game they could, because the environment and characters are really well designed for their time. And it was also a huge improvement compared to Konami's version, before Vatra's freedom. To help you understand what I mean, this is Konami's version that they showed in the press conference. You can see the face is missing a lot of details, the hair looks funny, and the environment in general seems like it's being pushed to be too dark, for the sake of being nightmarish. But Vatra's version next year was absolutely something else, and it felt like the game finally has a soul, and everything makes sense. Murphy's facial features and animations look on point. The places are very detailed with the right amount of darkness, and the town genuinely appears like Silent Hill. And speaking of the town, in my opinion, besides the games from Team Silent, Downpour is the only one where Silent Hill Town has the right oppressive atmosphere, defined by a constant sense of decay and isolation. In other words, it made me feel that I'm lonely and helpless. But at the same time, you can see that the place was full of life before it became a wasteland. The empty diners, the abandoned large homes and gas stations, they all indicate that the town used to be thriving, and many happy people lived in it. But somehow you're entirely alone, or at least that's what you think.
Where is everybody?
On top of that, the heavy rain dominates the mood here, and it looks insanely realistic, even in your clothes, which is a very good addition to the foggy streets. But there's also a catch behind it, because monsters actually become more aggressive when rain falls heavily. The developers were inspired by the Czech style of gloom, meaning that their hometown played a role in their vision when imagining a terrifying Silent Hill town. And this makes sense because Eastern Europe is known for having these mysterious, spooky locations that feel very secluded in the winter season. And this is amazing for me because I always imagine this specific rainy weather when I think of a horror story in my mind. I mean, at the end of the day, nothing is more scary than isolation in our real life and the loneliness of certain real locations during winter. So, to be honest, Downpour is very unique in this aspect because here, it's less about fog and more about an endless, wet calmness that seeps into every corner, which is peaceful on the outside, but very stressful inside your mind.
Poor little guy.
When it comes to mechanics, Downpour also has its own touch and brings a mix of classic Silent Hill elements with some fresh tweaks. You play from a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective, which is useful because exploration is a very big deal here, and you have the ability to roam a much larger map compared to the previous entries. This means that you need to open your eyes everywhere because every place contains tools and secrets, even if you don't see them at first sight. You can find crucial stuff on the ground, keys casually sitting on the kitchen table, and let's also not forget that you can pretty much use anything as a weapon. And speaking of weapons, the combat here leans heavily on melee, and I say heavily because using firearms is not a good idea at all. But I will explain this part later when it's time to mention the downsides. But even though melee is highly recommended here, you should always remember that the tools you fight with are not usable forever, because they can literally break after a certain number of strikes, which is a realistic feature but can be a pain in the butt sometimes. And as I said earlier, encounters under the rain are more dangerous, because the rain is intentionally designed to cause monsters to show up from nowhere and be more powerful, forcing you to escape in certain scenarios. Story-wise, Downpour has a clear inspiration from Silent Hill 2, because the game digs into Murphy's past as a criminal, peeling back layers of his guilt and secrets, even through the choices you make, like whether to help or abandon certain characters. Murphy is also haunted by visions of his past, and he's tied to a murder that he may or may not have committed, which leaves room for your mind to fill the blanks with curiosity.
No, I'm done. I'm finished with the riddles, the mind games. Whatever I did to get here, I've had enough. I want out. Do you understand me? Do ya?
This pushes you to have questions about Murphy's morality and wonder whether he's really a bad guy with a shameful history or he's simply misunderstood and trying to clear his name. But what I personally admire about Downpour is the low-key antagonist, George Sewell. He is a normal officer at the prison, but his corruption and sinister plans play a significant role in messing with Murphy's psyche.
How's it going, Murph? Heard you're gonna be leaving us soon.
What do you want, Sewell?
He's a deceptive, ruthless person who uses his authority to exploit inmates for his own gain, showing no loyalty to colleagues or even allies. In fact, the biggest mistake that Murphy made in the entire game is striking a deal with George to help him reach a certain inmate that Murphy wants revenge from. I don't want to spoil the story for those who didn't play the game, but in summary, George is the most realistic antagonist in Silent Hill's history, at least for me, because he precisely embodies the role of a douchebag, who seems like a side character at first, but ends up leading Murphy to a devastating tragedy, which eventually becomes the driving force of his entire mental suffering. And even though George doesn't show up physically throughout the game, his presence inside Murphy's flashbacks and memories is truly unsettling.
So what's it gonna be, Murphy? You and me gonna play ball? Or is all your hard work for nothing?
However, he's not your only problem, because there's also a female officer in the game who hunts you everywhere. But her case is different, because she sees you as the source of her pain for something you did. But this detail is only revealed at the ending of the game, which is a genius tactic to keep you always confused. With all of this being said, it's time now to talk about the downsides, because Downpour definitely has its flaws, and they can be big ones too. The most obvious one is the combat. The melee is insanely clunky, and the attacks are very, very sluggish, in the sense that sometimes you can spend more time trying to fix your position than actually fighting. On top of that, there's no dodge mechanic, and all you can do is run away or block, which is a huge problem when enemies swarm you in tight spaces. And once again, the breakable weapons are very annoying, and no matter how realistic this is, they still seem like they break too fast, leaving you defenseless in the most crucial moments, which makes no sense. But no matter how bad the melee is, using guns and firearms in general is far worse, to the extent that they can make you feel it's not worth it to use them. I mean, there's basically no aiming mechanics here, because the game technically aims for you. And this makes the whole action feel stiff and becomes a chore. You also can't have two guns at the same time, meaning that picking up a new one automatically leads to dropping the old one. This explains why ammo here is extremely rare, forcing you to conserve every freaking shot. And it seems like the game doesn't want you to use guns as much, which is a problem for someone like me who loves gunning down enemies in survival horror games. And when it comes to the enemies, this aspect was also criticized by so many people, because you basically face just 5 or 6 monster types, and most of them seem bland, and they lack the symbolic style that Silent Hill is known for.
The one with your skin splayed out from within. Once the monster has his fun. Oh, God!
But even if we digest all these issues and let it slide, the performance and optimization of this game during release was not only the straw that broke the camel's back, but it basically buried the camel entirely. Frame rate drops, long loading times, and glitches were common, to the extent that the game can feel unplayable, because you literally can't enjoy exploring the areas without freezes here and there. Luckily, the patches fixed a lot of this later on, but only after a large number of gamers already gave up and lost their appetite for playing. which gave the game a horrible reputation among potential consumers. And speaking of consumers, I think it's time now to talk about what matters the most, which is how Downpour was received in general, what the press said about it, and most importantly, the tragic consequences of its release. In 2012, game and media outlets were way more significant and influential than they are today, meaning that sometimes they could actually have a huge role in pushing many players away from a certain game or convincing them to try it. Sadly, Downpour was an example of a game that received no mercy in reviews from most major outlets. And it's mainly due to the issues that I mentioned earlier, especially the technical ones, like the terrible performance. The most famous one is IGN, and they gave Downpour a devastating 4.5 out of 10. Eurogamer gave it a 6, and the score on Metacritic didn't even reach the 65 mark, leading many casual players to feel hesitant to try the game because no one was recommending it.
I'm not going back. You might as well shoot me.
Fine.
Some websites complimented certain aspects of Downpour, including Vatra's effort in building a chilling atmosphere. But the upsides were usually mentioned like a secondary thing. But besides media reviews, you also need to keep in mind that Downpour came out during the worst time in Silent Hill's history. Literally. This is a time when so many Silent Hill fans already lost hope in the franchise due to Konami's mismanagement after multiple failed games, meaning that a large number of players were expecting Downpour to be another flop, even before playing it. This pessimism led the Silent Hill fanbase to have high expectations for Downpour and see it as a game designed to revive the series, which also meant that no one was ready to tolerate any flaws, let alone the disastrous performance and glitches that the game had when it saw the light. Long story short, Downpour was not satisfying for most people, and as a result, it was a commercial flop, with a very disappointing number of sales even after several months of release. For Konami, this was nothing more than another failed project that they could live with. But for the developers at Vatra, this was a disaster on so many levels. First of all, keep in mind that Vatra at that time was owned by another big British company called Kuju, which was supporting them financially and eagerly waiting for their success with Downpour. In July 2012, after 4 challenging months following the release of Downpour, Kuju began to panic, leading them to take extreme steps that can end Vatra's future forever.
No.
And sadly, this is exactly what happened 1 month later, on August 16, 2012, when Kuju officially declared that they would no longer own or support Vatra, which means that the small studio is now entirely alone, facing its tsunami of issues while everything is falling apart. These sad events eventually led to a very tragic outcome in September 2012, when the studio was declared bankrupt and closed its doors once and for all, making it the saddest game development story in Silent Hill's entire history.
This is it, Pendleton. Any last words?
Yeah. I'll see you in hell. Cupcake.
But the actual sad part for me is that people didn't even know that the main reason behind Downpour's failure was not Vatra's poor work. Instead, it was literally Konami's involvement in the work. According to the animation director at Vatra, the producers at Konami were very involved in many details inside the game, often opposing any creative ideas from the developers. These Konami producers are the reason why the monsters' designs were underwhelming and bland, because they rejected all the unique designs from Vatra's artists.
Pendleton. Get on the bus.
In fact, most of Vatra's designers resigned before finishing the game, because hundreds of their designs were not accepted by Konami, forcing them to get fed up and leave. It was also clear that Konami's producers were insanely strict in pushing their horrible ideas, in a way that developers had no chance to push back.
I'm Devin Chatsky, producer of the game, and I'm joined here today by Brian Gomez, design director at Vatra Games, the development studio attached to the project.
And to be honest, I understand how this led to a disaster. Because in general, I feel like producers Devin and Tom had no idea about how to promote a real Silent Hill game. This leads us to the second issue from Konami, which is the limited resources provided to the developers and the terrible promotion campaign that was basically meant to save them money, and that's it. I mean, watch this short promotion segment from Konami's producer Devin and tell me how the heck this energy can convince you to buy their game.
We just hit a major milestone on our Silent Hill Facebook page, 500,000 fans. So to thank you for your support, we put together a sneak peek at our E3 demo. So take a look at this trailer for some exclusive footage.
I think you get the point, but even with marketing and designs aside, apparently Vatra developers were also forced to downgrade their own game Downpour, just to try to make it work properly on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 during release, which still led to a horrible optimization on top of the downgrade in visual quality. Do you understand how insane this is? It simply means that Vatra made a gorgeous-looking game, and they were planning to spend more time on it, to make sure it's ready to work well on consoles. But Konami rushed them into releasing it halfway for commercial reasons, even at the expense of the game's overall quality. Not only that, but they also cancelled the PC version, which was literally intended to be the best version, where you can experience the game with its full potential. This makes me believe that the flaws in the combat and overall gameplay were also a result of Konami's involvement. I'm very angry because if you focus on Downpour deeply, you can see the talent of Vatra's developers, despite all the issues. The visuals, the town's atmosphere, and the walk-in animations were all exceptional for their time. And some people even say that certain animations in Downpour are actually better than the ones in Silent Hill 2 Remake. In other words, Downpour is a very sad case of a good game that found itself in a situation where everything is against it, whether it's Konami's reckless management or the players' lack of patience and their refusal to give it a chance. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments below what you think about Downpour's tragic story. Do you agree with me that it was treated unfairly by everybody and deserves a second chance through a remake or a remaster soon? Or do you believe that it should remain in the past? Anyway, see you very soon.
I can't. I'm sorry. I can't do it.